The visual style and quality of anime often fall into four categories. There's realism, where, as the name suggests, the animation largely mirrors real life. The stories don't have to be completely realistic, but the animation style and aesthetics are. There's semi-realism, where the attempts at being realistic are interspersed with more over-the-top and outlandish moments. There's cartoonish, where realistic qualities are altered out of proportion and expressed with bold lines and colours. And finally, there's surrealism, where any attempts at lifelike animation are thrown out the window in the name of artistic expression. Most of the anime that we watch all fall into these four categories. But what if I told you there's a fifth category, and it's largely dominated by a single director? Realism in anime is usually achieved through the background art and character designs. Artists attempt to imitate and sometimes even sketch over photos of real landscapes. Meanwhile, character designers give the characters as lifelike qualities as possible, with realistic proportions, eyes, and hairstyles. But one director has taken the quest for realism to a whole new level, so much so that they've moved beyond the boundaries of realism and into a fifth category that I call hyperrealism. Makoto Shinkai is one of the most acclaimed anime directors working today. If you haven't heard his name before, you've most definitely seen his work. Your Name and Suzume are his most acclaimed films, although Weathering with You and 5 cm per second are also fan favourites. Shinkai's movies are heavily praised for their animation quality, a result of his long partnership with the studio Comics Wave Films. Even if you've never sat and watched one of them, you've definitely seen clips of the animation quality from these films on social media. But it's one of Shinkai's more underrated films that truly pushes the boundaries of realism in anime. Released in 2013, The Garden of Words is definitely one of Shinkai's most grounded and mundane films. The story follows Takao Akizuki, a 15-year-old with a passion for cobbling, and Yukari Yukino, a 27-year-old woman Takao meets while bunking off school at the local garden. Unlike Your Name and Suzume, there are no fantastical elements or grand sweeping action. The Garden of Words is a purely grounded story, as the plot focuses exclusively on Takao and Yukari's dreams and their friendship. The entire film features the quality of animation that Shinkai is known for, but it's the opening scene that is, in my opinion, one of the most realistic scenes in anime history, and the reason why the film is so good. Welcome to my ongoing series called Moments of Brilliance. In this series, I break down the small moments that reveal how and why these stories affect us so much. This is the second video in what will hopefully be a long-running series. But before I progress, obviously, slight spoilers ahead. As previously mentioned, The Garden of Words is filled with all the typical qualities that make it a realistic anime. The quality of animation is insane, the background art is borderline photorealistic, and the character designs are grounded and lack the usual anime eccentricities. But that's not what pushes the film beyond the boundary of realism into hyperrealism. In fact, the film's most impressive and realistic quality is so subtle, you probably didn't even notice it. Animation has a lot in common with live-action filmmaking. There are aspect ratios, framing, cinematography, colour, and many other visual elements to take into consideration across both mediums. But the one thing that animation lacks is a physical camera. With live-action filmmaking, this gives directors and DOPs the option to either go handheld or to place the camera on a mount or tripod for a more stable image. But because animation is physically drawn, there's an unnatural smoothness to the camera movement, if it can even be called a camera at all. It's as though every scene was shot on a dolly or tripod. But The Garden of Words moves into hyperrealism by breaking that trend. The opening scene depicts Takao's daily journey as he skips school to spend time at his local garden and work on his drawings. Starting on the train, Takao walks from the station to the garden, journeys through the beautiful scenery, and sits down at a gazebo. The shots of Takao and the landscape are beautifully animated, but it's the camera movement that makes the scene so effective and lifelike. As I said earlier, The Garden of Words is Shinkai's most grounded and realistic film, and it's this opening scene that establishes the realism of the story and the world it takes place in. In a creative decision that is nothing short of genius, Shinkai decided to animate the opening scene as though it were being shot with a real camera. The film's opening shot depicts the branch of a tree gently dipping in and out of a pond. Starting with raindrops in the pond, the camera pans up, but the pan isn't clean. It shakes as though it's a handheld shot. This handheld style is only used within the garden, often depicting scenes of nature. The style is heavily contrasted with the shots of Takao on the train and the city beyond the garden. Take this scene for example. As Takao travels through the city, the shots are rigid and still. But the moment he enters the garden, the camera cuts to a quote-unquote handheld shot of his feet as he walks. Directors often use handheld shots for a sense of immersion, as the handheld nature mimics how our heads move as we walk. Shinkai's decision to use that technique in The Garden of Words still has the same effect, even though it's animated. This faux handheld style is used exclusively within the garden, but even the shots of the city imitate the properties of a real camera. One of my favourite shot types is when directors strap the camera to moving objects, like this scene in Matt Reeves' The Batman. The Garden of Words also imitates this style with its shot of the train Takao is riding on. The animation movement is so perfectly in sync with the train, it's as though the camera had been physically rigged to the undercarriage. The camera even shakes with the force and air resistance of the other train going past. But movement isn't the only way in which Shinkai mimics a real camera. In the opening scene in the garden, Makoto Shinkai also imitates one of the most overlooked aspects of cinematography in anime: focus. Anime doesn't completely disregard focus, but it's often used in a very basic way. The character or characters in a scene are usually animated in full clarity, and the background is then given a slight blur to draw our eyes to the subjects. But there are many aspects of camera focus that anime doesn't include. The obvious example in The Garden of Words is focus pulling. Take that shot of Takao walking through the park. The shot begins with Takao's feet in the background, with the bridge and the rain in focus, and his shoes distorted. As Takao walks closer, the camera pulls focus to Takao's feet, with the once clear bridge now becoming blurred. A similar focus pull is used when Takao is walking through the rain with his umbrella, starting with him out of focus before he becomes the central subject and the background blurs. Animating focus is already impressive enough, but Shinkai takes his knowledge and understanding of cinematography even further in this scene. As well as shifting and pulling focus, the animation also takes into account depth of field. Depth of field essentially dictates how much of an image will be in focus and how much will be blurred in relation to the distance from the camera. A deep depth of field means that most of the foreground and background will be clear, while a shallow depth of field means that the subject will be clear, while the background will be heavily blurred, or vice versa. Other aspects like lens choice can impact depth of field, but camera placement is a vital factor. The close-up shots of Takao walking through the park have a shallow depth of field. This is mainly due to the distance between the camera, Takao, and the background. Because Takao is relatively close to the camera, and the background is way off in the distance, the depth of field will be shallower. But in the wider shots, like this one of Takao walking over the bridge, the depth of field is far deeper, as Takao on the bridge and the city in the background are a good distance away from the camera, making them both fairly clear. The animation mimicking real camera work in the opening scene is absolutely beautiful, and helped to establish Shinkai and Comics Wave Films' reputation for having some of the best animation quality around. But these stylistic choices aren't just for show, they're also essential to The Garden of Words' story. As I said earlier, The Garden of Words is Makoto Shinkai's most grounded and realistic film. Just as the opening act has to establish and set up the story, the opening scene has to establish the visual style and tone. The decision to mimic a real camera isn't just a ploy to lure us in with beautiful animation, It grounds the animation, and by proxy, the characters in the setting, in a sense of realism. But it goes even further than that. I've already touched on the effect of handheld camera work and its immersion, but Shinkai's decision of when to and when not to use handheld adds to that immersion greatly. In the beginning of the film, Takao doesn't feel comfortable in the city. He hates school and is uninspired by his home life. It's only when he's in the garden that he feels at ease and motivated. The sudden switch between static and handheld as he enters the garden in the opening scene reflects this. Takao doesn't need to tell us he feels comfortable in the garden through expository dialogue. The camera does that for us. This shot that uses focus pulling doubles down on that feeling. The blurred Takao symbolises his feelings of alienation in the city. As he steps into focus, it again represents his feelings of ease and acceptance of his hobby within the garden. Beyond the mindset of the characters, the camera movement also defines the tone of the film. The Garden of Words is about the emotions and struggles of two characters. It doesn't have any adrenaline-inducing explosions, giant battles, or magic, and the use of handheld shots and faux realism reflects this. If the scene were animated using boring, still shots, it's likely that the overall film wouldn't have anywhere near the same emotional impact. On the other end of the spectrum, if the opening scene had massive, unrealistic camera movements, the grounded story would feel underwhelming and out of place. In the same way that eccentric, sweeping camera movements fit the giant scale of battle shonen, the handheld style and imitation of a tangible camera fits the realism of the Garden of Words. Makoto Shinkai's grander films, like Your Name and Suzume, might be his most popular works, but to me, the opening scene in the Garden of Words is the most realistic anime scene ever made, and to sum it up, it's pure brilliance. Thank you for staying to the end of the video. The support I've received starting up this channel really means a lot. I know that the Garden of Words isn't a perfect film, but it's one of my favourites, and I've wanted to make a video about this scene for a long time. If you enjoyed my ramblings about animation and cinematography, why not subscribe to the channel? Not only does it help me out on the platform, but it also lets you know when I drop more ramble-filled videos. And if you enjoyed this, why not check out my other videos, like this one on Freeren, or my first video on Fire Force. Once again, thank you.